This isn't a story about selling a house or realtors themselves. I think it's really about how AI is becoming essential in almost everything that we do.
All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. Exciting news, listeners. We're recording an episode of Mixture of Experts on site at Think 2026 in Boston this year. That takes place between May 4th to May 7th, and registration is now open. We're going to put the link in the episode description, or your IBM representative can help you with the next steps. I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to the 100th episode of Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a lovely group of thinkers and commentators working at the frontiers of artificial intelligence to make sense of the week's news. On this week's episode, we have Ritika Gunnar, General Manager for Data, Volkmar Uhlig, CTO and VP Data Platforms, and Kaoutar Maghraoui, Principal Research Scientist. Thanks to you all for joining. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about scientists using Claude Code. We're going to talk about the future of AI in finance. But first, I want to start with this really fun story about using ChatGPT to sell a house. I first want to start with this kind of fun story that got a lot of play on social media. This, I believe, first appeared in the New York Post. And it was a story about a guy who was looking to sell his house and got frustrated, as we all do if you've been here before, with realtors and the whole kind of world of real estate law and transactions, and decided to try to do the whole thing by himself via ChatGPT. And so the results, at least as they claim, are pretty good. He was able to sell his 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house for around $950,000, about $100,000 over what the real local estate agents had been giving him as an estimate. And really kind of helped him through the process, right? Using it for listing strategies, improvements to increase the kind of value of the house. I guess, Ritika, you're our special guest for today. Curious about how you read this story, and I don't know, are realtors doomed?
Well, I think it's a great story. And this isn't a story about selling a house or realtors themselves. I think it's really about how AI is becoming essential in almost everything that we do. And those that do work with AI are going to see those gains and those right kind of outcomes. This is about how AI has moved from being a general purpose operator for complex workflows, and how we're decreasing the skills that are necessary to be able to work with AI to be able to show those outcomes. And that's exactly what this guy did. He used it for every part of the workflow, and he used that to reduce the barrier. He's not a real estate expert himself, yet he was able to show those kind of outcomes. And it really shows the power of those that can use AI and the kind of outcomes they can achieve with them versus, well, I mean, take the other pool of real estate agents that were giving him a lower dollar value, the $100,000 less, those that were not. And so I think this is what we really have to see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Kaoutar, it was recalled to me actually by Pedro, one of our producers, that our very first MOE episode actually covered ChatGPT 2 was the release. That's what we were covering about 100 episodes ago. The technology really has come a very, very long way in a very short period of time. I guess I'm just curious if you want to give some reflection on that, like on how quickly things have been moving, because this is definitely something that it feels like GPT-2 would not be able to help out with definitively.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is what is showcasing this compression of expertise. And, these models have come a long way. So the low latency, interactiveness, human in the loop also, which of course, all these interactions with these models, is requesting, these prompting and so on. So, of course, these interactions, are short context, iterative, latency sensitive. So, and these models, since, the beginning, they've perfected a lot of these things. Of course, there are still challenges, but I think this is also showing, how far we've come along in terms of, AI just being a POV to really doing real things that are useful for people. And I think Ritika pointed that very rightfully. So what we're seeing here is it's not just about, the real, estate market, but this is a compression of the expertise. And now what these LLMs are effectively doing is really acting as distilled representation of that collective expertise. So and we've seen this, thousands, millions of similar scenarios. When you prompt them correctly, they can simulate what a top tier agent or expert might do. So this is not just automation, it's also about changing who gets access to expertise. It's democratizing that in a way. And that's really interesting. Uh, but so it's not just automating decisions, it's also kind of standardizing them. And that might reshape how markets behave. So I think it has some really strong implications here. And I think when I see this is also raising also a subtle question. Are we increasing intelligence in the system? Or are we just synchronizing behavior here? Because are we homogenizing also, some of these markets? Because if all we're using the same AI agents, so the markets may become more efficient, but also they might also become more homogeneous and algorithmically shaped. So
Yeah,
that's
that'll be a very
interesting.
funny outcome. Is it like turns out that like every house starts to look even more alike in the listings because
Similar.
everybody's
Yes.
following what ChatGPT is telling them about. Volkmar, I'm gonna, I guess, prey on your biases a little bit. As a lawyer, I am very proud to say that they note in the article that they use ChatGPT for everything except for reviewing the contract. And for that, they actually used a human lawyer. I guess the question is like, do you still think there's sort of like limits to how far this technology will go in terms of automating the expertise? Are lawyers going to have a job, or is it just a matter of time before they also become, subject to the same forces that are playing out here?
I would guess that the lawyer is going to be replaced as well. Because I think I'm kind of leaning here on Elon. He made this comment about AI. You cannot have, like, if you imagine Excel and you would have everything in Excel automated except for like a few functions, then the utility of Excel goes down dramatically. Right. And so what his argument is only when you're closing the loop 100%, you can actually get the economic gains. And so I'm on that side. So the lawyer will be the lawyer will go as well.
Okay,
Grim
can I be on the
news.
other side? Can I be on the other side of
Yeah, of course
Volkmar,
you can.
please?
Yeah.
Are you a lawyer?
I'm gonna lawyer that.
Yeah.
But my perspective on this is a little bit different. Like I think that while I think there's a difference between lawyers that will use AI and lawyers that will not use AI. And so I think the human in the loop aspects of taking the expertise that a lawyer has across like decades of experience and across different kind of domains and functions, that you want your lawyer to be able to use AI to be able to automate and catch as much as possible. And that lawyer ends up becoming a lot more efficient at their job and able to do tasks that are more interacting with the human, like getting the input, like really working with the human and along kind of things like understanding kind of even some of the emotional aspects of things. In this particular case in real estate, there may not be that, but when you're talking about things like that are probably more ephemeral in nature, like marital or like parental or things like that, there's always an aspect where that human part and that human in the loop should not be replaced. And so you should definitely use the AI, and you have to use the AI to be able to have some differentiation in how you can actually accelerate what it means, where you need to be able to focus on, and still have that human in the loop. So I think there still will be lawyers, but I think the bar for those lawyers is now a lot higher. It is much higher.
So I think, Ritika, to chime in here as well, I agree with the cases you chose, like, anything which has an emotional component to it, or complications which are not like, high volume transactional. I think anything which is high volume transactional will be automated. And if I look at the real estate market, where, I mean, I didn't even have a lawyer for my real estate transaction. I think that one, from my perspective, anything is high volume, it has a high chance of automation. And then we will get the exception cases flagged. I think what will also happen is, because the lawyers can waive 98% through, the transaction cost on the lawyer will become almost zero. Right. So I think that, but I totally agree that, will we have no lawyers? No, I don't think that.
I also agree. I think lawyers won't be replaced by AI, all of them, but the legal profession will be transformed more than almost any other white collar field because, like legal search, document review, drafting, all of that will be completely automated. So entry level roles will be displaced. Ritika, you mentioned this, but so the bar will be much higher. But what AI cannot replace is like judgments and strategy, legal interpretation in ambiguous situations, courtroom advocacy, client trust. Those, still need a lot of human
But
accountability.
by the way, like my perspective on the entry level workers being displaced is also a little bit different there too, because I do believe you're going to need entry level workers because entry level workers need a place to be able to have more mature senior level workers. You need to be able to start out and have entry level workers. And the way in which those entry level workers can probably progress to being more senior or knowledgeable probably accelerates as well. But I do feel like this notion of only having senior professionals that know a certain job task is incorrect when you take the long-term view because you're always going to have to refill like the bucket of who are the entry-level people today that are going to be your experts tomorrow. So I think while the way in which you would probably drive the workforce into that funnel will change, I do think it will change. I still think you need entry-level workers because who are the experts of tomorrow?
Ritika, maybe a final question for you is I think a little bit about like where all some of this goes in terms of what it means for the professions. If you're a realtor, like one of the reasons that ChatGPT can do this is that there's lots of data, right, with which these models can learn about how do you sell a house well and how do you position a house well. I actually wonder whether or not there's going to be incentives for professions over time to become almost like more guild-like. They want to keep more things secret and away from these models because the minute the models get access to them, they can do the things that these people are offering. Do you think that's going to be like almost like an increase in secrecy, almost right, because
Well,
of the pressure of these things?
yeah, I have two comments to that. Number one, like if you look at a lot of these LLMs are a great representation of all the public data out there in the world. That is like known. And if you look at this gentleman, he took like all the public data that was out there and used that to become a better real estate professional to be able to help him in his personal endeavors. And so really what do organizations have to be able to claim like their value? They have their private data, their in the case of companies, their enterprise data, in the case of personal, their private data becomes the way that differentiates them. And this is why like I fundamentally believe that the value in applications, we used to say AI is only as good as your data. That was the case when AI was really about building machine models, and your data was the fuel to be able to go drive those models. Now, I believe your enterprise data or your personal and your private data is the application because your LLM is a great representation of the public data. Your private data is your value, whether you be an enterprise or whether you're a personal person. That's number one. I think in what you pointed out too, I think there's a second piece that goes through my mind of, you know, um, I think many of us have children of like either college or that are young in their either educational or professional career. And we used to kind of really talk about reading, writing, and arithmetic were kind of the things that we wanted to focus on to be able to drive our kids. And I used to always, when AI was kind of making waves even a decade ago, I would be like, I think the fourth thing we want is coding. Well, now we know that a lot of the Gen AI tools can do the coding, but there is a foundation of understanding how to work with Gen AI tools that is going to be essential for every profession. And I think that's one of the things that this also teaches is the skills barriers have lowered, but they've lowered if you know how to work with these tools and if you know how to be able to drive value from them. And so I think that is one of the things where I do think this article teaches us, should we be better at really enabling everybody to work with these tools? Because that's going to be the difference and the differentiation of a lot of work that happens in the future.
Yeah, and I think here it's not really the entry level, like you said, jobs that are disappearing, but the tasks. The level tasks that we know today are changing. So And so those tasks, I think we will expect, these entry level professionals to know how to use these AI tools. And that is important as part of their upskilling.
Great. I'm going to move us on to our next topic. This was a fun sort of blog post on a Substack I follow called Republic of Science by a guy named Charles Yang. This didn't get a whole lot of play online, but I think it was sort of an interesting analysis, certainly the first version of this analysis that I've seen before. This guy, Charles, I think is interested in what's the adoption of AI agents in the sciences. And so he does a kind of rough and ready analysis, probably using Claude Code himself, that pulls basically what are known as ORCID profiles. These are kind of identifiers for academic researchers, and then sees whether or not those profiles have GitHubs where they're using Claude. And he kind of comes out with this analysis, and I'll just quote here. Out of 14 million total ORCID profiles, we identify about 15,000 profiles that kind of fit the definition of using sort of Claude Code. And I think the rough estimate that he ends up giving is basically that of his analysis, about 2.1% of scientists with these linked GitHub profiles are using agents. And I think one of the most interesting things, just to kind of throw one of the kind of factoids that come out of the analysis, is that you would assume that this kind of distribution of adoption might lean, say, younger, right? Like people who are more familiar with the tech might be adopting it faster. But he finds this kind of interesting bell curve where it's like more established academics and younger academics using these agents. And I guess, Volkmar, maybe I'll start with you. Like, do you buy this analysis? Is it a little too rough and ready? Do you think it's a good indicator for like how adoption is happening, or?
It's a lot of bias in there.
Okay.
So I, just as a scientist, I'm not sure whether if I take the sub cohort of public GitHub repositories of my total cohort, if that is not biased towards people who are more on the coding side and therefore have a higher adoption. I think if I step back and ignore the numbers a little bit, I think what it shows is that there is a wide adoption. I would have expected that the percentage is much higher. I think, I would have expected like 30 to 40%. So I was surprised by the low number, simply because the productivity just is so much higher. So, if you get a 10 to 100x productivity gain, why would you not take that, right? And so the real question you are asking as the underlying one is there an age bias towards, or a skills bias towards using AI, like where young people use it aggressively and then more established people use it, and then in the middle they still try to weasel themselves out of AI. My expectation would have been that there is a much more even distribution. So that was the actually interesting, the fact. So two things was like, why is the adoption so low? Then you need to ask, like, how did you find out that it's Claude? Do they use other tools? Do they copy paste? Blah blah blah. Right? There's lots of questions. But I think the second question we should then also ask is, if research uses AI to that extent, what's the percentage of research which is actually true innovation versus just a repetition, because the model needs to know the answer? And then are we now accelerating or decelerating in science? Because if we decelerate because we are, we are moving the bell curve to the middle because everybody knows what's in the public domain, or do research suddenly have 10 times the output because they're so much faster to actually make the science work? And so maybe we get an acceleration in the sciences. I do not know.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Kaoutar, this is in some ways a variant of what you talked about in the context of real estate almost on this last point, is like almost the idea of like, if everybody starts adopting these technologies, is there kind of just like a lumping towards the middle? Everybody's doing the same thing. And so it actually might, like all of this AI adoption may actually not have that big of an effect on research progress.
But Tim, it's
I
a
don't know,
new
Volkmar,
middle.
if that's what you're trying to say.
It's a new middle, right? I mean, we are saying, yes, everybody kind of converges on the middle, but the middle moves dramatically because the quality of the middle is actually much, much higher.
Yeah.
So it may be a jump, right?
Right. Everybody's doing the same thing, but it's all better.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, that's right.
I also found, the results that they were showing probably, lower than what I expected. But I think there is also some other aspect maybe that we need to think a little bit more deeper about. So if for science, like, for example, if you look at software engineering, if an agent writes code and it compiles and runs, we often accept that as good enough. But in science, that standard sometimes breaks down. It's not enough for something to run. You need to know why it works, whether it's reproducible, whether someone else can independently verify it. And today's, if you look at the behavior of these agents, fundamentally, they're not designed for that. They're probabilistic by nature. They're non-deterministic systems. They don't produce a clean execution trace sometimes, and they don't give you a guarantee that if you rerun the same workflow tomorrow, you'll get the same result. And I think that is a big gap that we have today, especially for maybe scientists to adopt it, much broadly. So there is maybe this mismatch if we're deploying productivity-oriented AI systems into like kind of these truth-seeking workflows. And so are we, need to maybe look, how do we make these systems more deterministic, calibrated, traceable, etc., for science? But I also think, using AI as kind of a trusted assistant is going to be very important to accelerate science. So they have to work hand in hand with the scientists. And it's a big productivity boost.
Ritika, I guess you're here, so I want to use the opportunity to talk about the data story that's maybe kind of implicitly hiding here. It sounds like we all have kind of beef with how Charles did the analysis. But I think the basic story, I think, is a little bit interesting on, is the kind of data that you would need to accelerate science using AI, is it even there, right? It seems to be one of the big questions that sticks out in my mind. And, I guess I could assume that certain fields where the data is kind of ready to go may see these accelerations, whereas ones that don't are going to be a little bit slower. And so it almost seems like you could say that like AI is going to have this very lumpy effect on scientific progress. Do you buy that?
I definitely think so. I think if you look at this particular research study, I think there are many kind of things I found in the bias of the study itself, which I'll come to in a moment. But then when you think about most researchers that are working on their projects have some sort of data sets that are very personal to them. And the ability to be able to have those data sets in the right format, whether those be in structured databases of some sort or unstructured documents somewhere or images or videos, and to be able to have the right context that's being used by these models becomes really essential to be able to get the kind of right outcome and usage of it. Which will then bring me to like the second part. For that to be useful, you need to make sure, like in this study, kind of some of the things that it assumes is that checking in code to a Git repo is analogous to pretty much a lot of the work that would be done with a lot of these researchers. If you look at a lot of research work that is done today, there's so many other tools that are being used by a lot of researchers that are especially data-driven, which is where a lot of research and science happens. MATLAB, SPSS, Excel, whatever databases that they have, that's usually where a lot of their work resides. And so driving AI where their data sits becomes really important. And that may not be necessarily where like a coding agent, whether that be Claude Code or any other code tool that be out there, is really gonna excel. That's probably a different kind of AI usage on your data sets or providing the right kind of context to that model as you're kind of driving it. And I think we completely miss that when we're taking a look at this.
Yeah, I love that as kind of it's unrepresentative. It just shows you which fields overly adopt GitHub, right? I mean, I think there's kind of a conclusion that he draws at the end, which is like economists use Claude Code more. And it may just be that like economists have work that takes place more through the context of GitHub. So through this lens, we can see that there's more Claude Code, right?
Most scientists, like if they're working with sensitive proprietary data, think about patient data that may be HIPAA data, think about data that is like either on genomics or it's not easily accessible. And so like that too, like we underrepresent how critical some of that is and how much like we want to be like how we deal with that as it's working with AI as well.
Yeah, I think the data set that he used, in the study, only includes scientists with GitHub and scientists who link GitHub with OrcID. And that's a very tiny and also highly technical subset. So it's a very narrow slice of really computationally active researchers. It also excludes, wet lab scientists, clinicians, field researchers, social scientists, and that's a huge, number that's not represented, in this study. And I think if I recall, the size also only lists 331 users. And I don't think this is enough to generalize across global science. So there is definitely some measurement bias here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually, I mean, points to, I think, an important issue. This debate has played out a little bit, I'm aware, in the kind of healthcare and AI space, where a lot of people have said, like, well, it's going to take so long for AI to shape healthcare. And then I think one counter argument is, well, a lot of patients are using ChatGPT already to do a lot of kind of medical style things. And so there's this vast kind of shadow AI economy, basically, that exists in a lot of these spaces that are just hard to measure for one reason or another. And I think that's pretty interesting. I'm going to move us on to our third topic. This was kind of a fun sort of executive profile that popped up in Fortune magazine. It's a story about Adobe CFO Dan Dern. And I think, overall, I think it's like a glossy feature about all the cool work that he's doing at Adobe. But I think is a nice hook for talking a little bit about how sort of teams within enterprises are adopting AI and what that looks like. And sort of the substance of the piece is basically that his vision for his finance team at Adobe was, we're going to do a lot of the AI stuff in-house, right? I think the actual article kind of touts his team as sort of an AI lab onto itself. And, it's sort of interesting. They're using the AI not for anything, particularly shocking, but is apparently saving them a lot of time. So using autonomous software agents to forecast results and scan contracts and manage inboxes. I think the question I want to ask, and maybe, Ritika, I'll kick it to you first, is what's so interesting is like this kind of question about who's going to own AI innovation in a company. There's one model I could imagine, which is we just have like the IT department or the AI department handles this for the company. But some of these technologies are so easy to use. It's almost an idea that like, well, everybody can kind of be building their own tools all the time. And so I guess the kind of sharpen that into a question. It's like, do you have a prediction for how this will eventually evolve? Like, if at some point it will be like, oh yeah, they'll just be the AI team inside these companies, or if it will look a lot more distributed and everybody kind of launching their own like local projects, which is crazy from an IT standpoint, but also might drive a lot of progress.
Yeah. We actually did a CEO and CIO study on this with IBM called IBM Institute in Business Value Study, where we actually queried over hundreds of CXOs to kind of understand how they're driving their AI projects. And even including our own within IBM, I would tell you there are different representations of this across like how everyone's doing it. But what I see as being successful projects really starts from there's the technology aspect. That's one thing. But really, there are two other pieces that I see that really kind of determine whether projects are going to be successful or not. The second is really the processes, because like you have these workflows or processes that you have in your organization of how you build these apps or institute these apps. And as you're inserting something like AI, which can actually take action and do a lot of the automation itself, the process itself needs to change. And so you really need to have a top down, and you're seeing that in the Adobe article. And I would tell you, even at IBM with Jim Kavanaugh and his office, I know he's doing the same thing. Where top down, there is a kind of a view of we will go do this, and there's also a bottom up where we allow the experimentation. And in the middle there, you'll see kind of a lot of AI center of excellences that really help bring together the technology and the processes to do these kinds of things. So that's really kind of like the second on the process. But the third, and was probably the most fundamental thing between projects that succeed and those that don't, is the cultural transformation. Because now you're having people who are the finance experts who've never really dealt with these tools, working with these tools and really understanding how their work is changing. You have projects that used to take years that are now taking weeks and months. And so what happens and how do you reallocate resources back to new projects to start innovating too? So when I think about this, it's really the process and the cultural aspects that are become really even more important. But I think every function is going to transform. Is how they set up their center of excellence to really enable people more, and how you have a top down and a bottom up culture that becomes really important.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think it's like, I mean, you're almost saying like, yes, and, right? Like it has to kind of happen in all directions to get this
Yes,
to actually work.
I see like there is like an inevitable shift here to distributed AI. So having basically maybe two things here. We still need an AI platform team, which is going to be central to organizations, like a team that owns the infrastructure, the models, the API, the data pipelines, the guardrails, the tooling, the GPUs, the hardware infrastructure. But probably we're moving towards these distributed AI builders. It's like every team will become an AI team because AI will be embedded everywhere. It'll be embedded in sales, legal, HR, finance, product. So, and it's just, it's going to be kind of partially an AI team, every team. So I think I feel that's going to be a deeper shift of having just kind of a central AI team to everyone doing it. But maybe centralization will still be into the security, the platform, accessing the hardware, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's like, I mean, it's a really interesting question about kind of like the history of how functions evolve within companies, right? Like, I don't know. Again, I don't know the history of IT, but presumably, like a lot of companies started just installing PCs, and then after a while, they're like, "Oh, we really need a team to kind of like centralize and manage all this stuff." But maybe initially, it was kind of as chaotic as sort of like the AI transition has been. Volkmar, do you want to comment? I mean, Ritika has this really interesting point about how much like getting the culture of this works right. And I think the thing that I have in mind is you read the article and you're like, what are you using AI for? And it's like, well, extracting information from PDFs and managing inboxes and doing contract review. This was not the, hyper futuristic agentic future I was sold. But it seems like, I don't know, it may just be these like very boring use cases actually are the major cultural lever because people are like, oh, it's really helping me out with something very kind of practical and boring. And so I don't know, for me, it kind of rewrites what it means to kind of like reshape the culture. It's not really about like sort of inspiring people, right? It's like in some ways it's about like these like very day-to-day things.
Yeah, I think that if you look at an organization of that size, like Adobe or IBM or Microsoft, you name it, there's a lot of mundane tasks where there's a very large workforce just doing cranking the crank and moving stuff from left to right. And it's an absolutely critical business function. If you don't do it, your business stops. But on the flip side, it's very mundane. And if you look at the risk, if I make, decisions about the life and death of a patient, that's probably not what I want to right now give into the hands of an AI, but extracting a bunch of fields from a PDF. And if I have a bunch of safeguards in the middle, whether that failed or was successful, that's a very easily automatable task. And so when we started with AI adoption in the company, the first thing was always like, okay, how do I get all my documents into a data store that I can actually do something with it, right? And so I think we are through that phase now, and you can download stuff now from the internet. Like we have Open Rack out, you can just, point at a bunch of documents and boom, you have them in a database, right? And I think this is the very logical first step. And I think once you went through that valley of tears, now you can actually start looking at much more, agentic and more smart implementations. But these are like the low-hanging fruits of very high impact because, it's cumbersome, requires labor, and, the quality of, like they did these comparisons of the quality of labor, and it's AI already outperforms it because it's just, so from my perspective, I think it's a very logical thing, and it has an instantaneous impact with a very low risk on the business. And so, yes, that's usually your success story. But it is the building block for actually the higher level thinking, because once that is solved, now we actually free up resources and we can do something else.
Yeah, you've definitely hit on this theme a couple times, which I really like, which is, there's a tendency to be like, well, AI will never do that when it's actually already been doing that for a few months. It's like the rate of progress is fast enough that we're like, oh yeah, like actually your skepticism is not warranted because like you just haven't been paying close enough attention to what's happening.
And I think this example is a great example of showing adoption here, because what's happening in finance is actually one of the clearest signals of where enterprise AI is also going. Because finance here is uniquely positioned for agent adoption because it has structured data, clearly defined workflows, and also a lot of strong incentive for automation, built-in validation mechanisms. So it's kind of almost the ideal environment for agents to thrive. And I think what's interesting also in this example is also we're not just seeing automation, we're also seeing orchestration, which is also very important. So the LLM is not just replacing models or tools, it's also sitting on top of coordination, data extraction, forecasting, reporting, generating, reports and narratives. So it's a kind of a very interesting and different paradigm from the traditional software. So it's kind of setting the very good examples of, enterprise AI.
Well, I think, Kaoutar, there are two. If I look at the areas where I see the fastest adoption, it's primarily where data sets are readily available, right? And in the finance industry, because of regulatory requirements and record-keeping requirements, everything is already kind of organized, because if you ever have an audit, you better pull out the document. The other one where I see a lot of adoption is in coding, right? Because we put everything in GitHub and every change is tracked, everything, the tooling was built around organizing large groups of people working in collaboration on a common code base. And so that is also highly tooled. And so I think this is where the two areas where we see very, very rapid adoption.
I'm going to add a third to that, Volkmar. I'll tell you, we did a study over the few thousand engagements, AI engagements that we've done, and we found that there were primarily three areas. So the first, you kind of got it right out. It's the coding. It's how do you start automating not just coding, but the software development lifecycle. So that is definitely one of them. The second, and I think that finance is just an example of this, or back office tasks, because it's the easiest place to get started. So if you look at finance, that's one. Supply chain is another that we've seen quite a bit of work on. If you look at marketing tasks, if you look at tasks that kind of sit in human resources, these are the areas where you can there's high access to data, your own data as an enterprise, where you need to not only automate, but as Kaoutar pointed out, really importantly, orchestrate across all of these. And you can not only see efficiencies, but you can start to find new ways of doing things. The third area that we really didn't discuss, but we see this everywhere, is in customer care. How do you have better support? How do you have better knowledge of your clients? How do you have better ways to target, to be able to do adjacency targeting for different products or combinations of things? It is probably the biggest area that is even further transformed from when we started in the AI era. So these are the three areas, when you think about customer care, what you do in the back office and what you do in the software development lifecycle area, that we think that there is dramatic improvements that you can get from agentic technologies.
Ritika, maybe a final thought here before we close up. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the reverse of what you just said, right? Where you started, these are where the changes are going to happen. Kind of curious if you have thoughts on what's going to be the hardest or the last, if you have a sense of that, because that's also almost a really interesting set of questions.
I think I talked about this a little bit, but where there is emotional intelligence that is really needed in day-to-day jobs, that is an area where I think is going to be really hard to replace what humans bring. That EQ component is so critical, by the way, in everything that we do today. And I think that EQ component, when a lot of your job has an EQ element to it, that's one. Two, physical labor jobs. So when we think about, and I think there's been a lot talked about this, of jobs that really require those kinds of physical labors, plumbing, electricians, I think, you've seen a lot of, there are going to be different kinds of jobs where those jobs are going to be hard to be able to be replaced completely by artificial intelligence. And so I think those are just a couple of examples. I think there's more. And then, like I said, I think that every profession, it's not there is not going to be work in those areas for humans. It is how that work actually changes and how you are an AI first organization as you do that.
I just saw maybe a different take on the plumber, those jobs. But now there is a lot of work on physical AI and humanoid robots, which maybe they're trying also to bridge those gaps. I think the next phase after agentic AI, I feel it's the era of robots and autonomous agents and autonomous cars. And I think, maybe that's the next big thing that's coming, is having some of these things also be disrupted by AI. we're just not there yet, scientifically and algorithmically, but I see that's happening next.
Yeah, I got to retool from being a lawyer to a plumber for a few years, at least until the robots go there. So, well, this is a great conversation. Kaoutar, Volkmar, Ritika, thanks for joining us. And that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks so much to all our listeners for following us for 100 episodes. And if you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere.